So now we're on to our next speaker. We're very fortunate to have Eric McGee, Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. He is, as I think most of you know, one of the most respected researchers in this field in the state, really, and in the nation as well. He's a frequent collaborator and does many other things beyond our work together as well. And we're always fortunate to have him involved in anything that we do. And really his body of work at PPIC, if you're interested in this topic, I told you about our work, right, that you can get on our website. Really, I strongly encourage you to look at the work that Eric has done over the years. It's been enormously helpful in the conversation around turnout, disparities, and in what he's going to talk about today, which is the transformation of California's election administration. For a detailed bio, please look online at our agenda. Everybody's bios, of course, are there for your perusal. Eric, please take it away.
As Mindy said, I'm going to talk today about specifically the election reform side of things and the impact that that's had on equity and turnout in California. So Mindy and I have been collaborating on a lot of this stuff over the years, and so this is going to be kind of a compilation of the effects for a number of reforms that we've adopted over the last, say, 10 years in California. So it's been just a very busy, active time. I say it's the transformation of election administration because there's just been so much that's happened. So I'm going to be looking at all vote by mail, which now applies to the whole state, but originally kind of started with a few key counties. And then looking at vote centers and in-person, the consolidation of in-person voting options, which kind of started out with the vote by mail, but has since kind of separated from it. And then automatic voter registration, which is one of the most significant reforms that we've seen in California. And then I'll get into pre-registration, which is where you allow 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote and then have their record turn on when they turn 18, and then talk some about the changes that have been going on with justice-involved populations in voting. So just to level set here, I clearly stole this chart from Mindy. This is just to make clear that we've seen a lot of changes, and I'm going to be talking about the impacts on equity, on disparities and turnout, but we still have a lot of disparities that exist. This is historically, so 2018 is when some of these reforms are starting to come online, but this gives you kind of a sense of where things were before the reforms. And then there are still Latinos and Asian Americans are the blue and red bars compared to all voters, lower in every case. There's still gaps that exist. They may have closed some, and I'll show some evidence that in some cases they have closed some, but the disparity still persist. That's 2020, this is 2022. As Mindy said, when you get into midterms, the gaps grow quite a bit larger than in presidential, so they're still all there. We still have work to do, but this is to give you a sense of what some of these changes that we've done have how they've impacted some of these numbers. So first, the all vote by mail. We actually have quite a long history in California of voting by mail. We were, I believe, the first state that allowed for no fault absentee voting. That was way back in like 1978 or something. Somebody here probably can correct me or put a finer point on it, but it's been with us for a while, and there's actually a few counties, small rural counties, that have had all vote by mail elections with no in-person voting, except at the county registrar's office for quite some time. Then we adopted the Voters' Choice Act, which allowed counties to switch into an alternate kind of voting system that included all vote by mail, and then of course, the pandemic election really transformed this for California, as it did for so many other states, and we switched the entire state to all vote by mail. And when I said earlier that the vote center piece of it with the Voters' Choice Act got divorced from the all vote by mail, that's what I mean. Is in the pandemic, the whole state became vote by mail, and so suddenly, not just the Voters' Choice Act counties, which I'll talk about in a second, not just the Voters' Choice Act counties, but all counties went to vote by mail. The research that we've done on this, looking at the impact of this universal vote by mail, and again, this is just looking at this universal vote by mail piece of it and not at the whole sort of VCA package, the Voters' Choice Act package. Generally speaking, not just in California, so we've separated out the orange is California, the blue is the rest of the country. So this is actually looking at California in that broader context, because again, during the pandemic, a lot of states switched to all vote by mail. A lot of them have continued with all vote by mail. And it's generally been good for equity. These bars are showing you not the increase in turnout, but the how much the gap between, so for voters of color, it's voters of color and against non-Hispanic whites. And then for youth, it's relative to seniors. And the question is how much has that gap closed? And if it's a positive number, it's closing. If it's a negative number, it's expanding. And you can see with one exception for African Americans in the rest of the country, where there really wasn't much of an effect, all vote by mail has generally closed the gaps. And especially so in California in a couple of cases, right? So it's been, this piece of the election reform puzzle has generally been positive. Then there's this question of consolidating in-person voting. So one of the pieces of both the pandemic and the Voters' Choice Act was to reduce the number of in-person voting options. So we, as I said, every county now gets mail ballots, but then during the pandemic, we had a varied approach to in-person voting, and that allowed us to look at the impact that these different in-person voting options had on equity and turnout without getting it kind of mixed up in the all vote by mail piece of it, because every county got all vote by mail. And so, some just continue with their traditional polling place system, some consolidated polling places, but you still had to go to your neighborhood polling place. Some did something like what the Voters' Choice Act does, which is to consolidate the in-person voting options, but allow you to go to any option you want to in the county. You can go anywhere. Then there were the Voters' Choice Act counties, and then the 3 counties that I mentioned before that had all vote by mail. So this just is a map of it. You can see it became kind of a patchwork quilt of options during the pandemic. And then the Voters' Choice Act in particular had kind of some extra pieces to it, where it wasn't just that you had the consolidation. You also have to have a certain number of ballot drop boxes, early voting offered, and then some informal engagement with the community when you're making the transition to the Voters' Choice Act. And after COVID, it has expanded. So now we have another 14 counties that have adopted. They cover 78% of the registered voter population. So this is kind of, in some respects, this is the system that we use in California now. And we could expect that at some point, maybe it's 100% of counties. But the other counties that didn't explicitly switch to the VCA continued with their kind of pre-pandemic approach for the most part. And this is just, again, stealing from Mindy, a nice map of the counties and when they made their switch to the Voters' Choice Act. So the Voters' Choice Act, the bottom line is it's really become a very common way to administer elections in California, but it has this kind of in-person piece to it that is separate from from the vote by mail piece, which applies to all counties. And so what did that in-person voting change mean for voters? And specifically, we looked at it in the pandemic. And the answer was it wasn't as positive as the all vote by mail piece. So there's certainly a lot of research, much of it done by Mindy, that shows that voters of color prefer, in many cases, especially compared to other racial ethnic groups, to vote in person. And so you might expect, for that reason, that the changing the in-person voting options would have a particular impact on voters of color, and does. So this is showing for people who were registered as vote by mail, which doesn't really mean much anymore, but you can still sort of register that way. And for those voters, for Black and Latino voters, it actually expanded the participation gaps. And this is, so we had, for this research, we broke it out into the different types. The VCA, we separated out LA, which is a VCA county, but it's very big. The consolidated in-person voting that was like the VCA, and then the ones that still required you to go to your local neighborhood. And the impacts were negative in kind of every single type. And then also for the people who explicitly registered as preferring in-person voting, again, not a super meaningful distinction except sort of a revealed preference kind of sense, and the impact was even more negative. We've kind of, I think, with the Voters' Choice Act, gotten used to thinking of these things, the all vote by mail and the in-person options, as kind of a package deal, but they are now kind of separated in California, and we can see that there's a more negative impact for the in-person piece of it, but a more positive impact for the all vote by mail piece. Automatic voter registration is another major reform that's been passed. It is designed to make the registration process easier by essentially removing any complications to navigating that process when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when you go for renewing a driver's license, for getting a new driver's license or a state ID, same thing, then you just get those questions about voter registration as a matter of course. There's a touch screen. The touch screen takes you to those questions, whether you kind of want to answer them or not, and you have to answer them in order to complete your transaction. So the goal here is both to increase registration, but also to make for a more representative electorate. And then I think incidental to that is better voter file maintenance, making sure that the voter file is up to date when people move or change their circumstances. And we have seen, in fact, in California, quite a significant increase in the registration rate coincident with the adoption of automatic voter registration. It's been kind of an exciting few years for American politics, so people are kind of registering more in general, but also in California, we have seen a particular rise. So recently we did a look at the different ways that automatic voter registration might be impacting the registration file in California. And there's really kind of two ways that it could be having this effect, having some effect on the total registration rate. So if we imagine like kind of before, in some state before reform, across two elections, you might have a couple of new voters who come onto the file between those two elections. That's our sort of shaded boxes here. But you could also, between those two elections, you can have them drop off, right? And so then the net change to the file is 0 in that case. But then after the reform, maybe you add more new voters, right? So now you've actually expanded the size of the file by registering more people. But maybe you expanded the file by not losing the people who had dropped off before, who moved and then didn't get re-registered. You keep them on. And so from the perspective, they're not sort of new voters, but from the perspective of the size of the voter file, it makes the voter file bigger. And of course, you can have both, right? Where you keep those people on the file, you also add new voters, right? So the question was, what's the kind of mix between these two things? Why does that matter? Well, it's a question of whether you're expanding the size of the electorate or whether you're sort of maintaining the electorate that you have. Not that maintaining the electorate you have is a bad thing, but just that those are different concepts. And new registrants are more likely to come from underrepresented groups. They tend to be younger. They tend to be more likely to be Black, Latino, or Asian American, right? Compared to the people who are already on the file and you're trying to sort of keep from dropping off the file when they move. And these new registrants are less likely to be engaged, and so they need a different outreach strategy. So what did we find when we looked at the impact of this of AVR on these different types of outcomes. First of all, I will say that overall, AVR increases both of these things. So it increases both the address update rate and the new registration rate. It does it in California, and it does it in other states that have adopted it. And we were able to look nationally to be able to identify kind of that this is actually a causal effect. So it's that AVR is causing these changes, and not that that states adopt AVR coincident with the moment that they happen to have a lot of address updates or new registrations. But what about in California? So in California, we actually found that address updates were more common among middle-aged people. So the increase in address updates in California was more common among middle-aged people and among Asian Americans. There's definitely been that these are positive numbers means that there's been an increase across the board, but that it's been more common among those two groups. For new registrations, it's increased most, again, among kind of the middle-aged, but also among young people. And then again, among Asian Americans, and not quite as much among, say, blacks or Latinos. And as I mentioned before, there's going to be a different outreach strategy that's required for new registrants who come in through AVR. So if you look this is looking at people who moved across county lines, people who moved within county lines. This dotted line is the total overall turnout rate in 2020. And then you have for each of these groups. So for the movers, it's actually not that far off. And in one case, for the cross-county movers, actually a little bit above the overall statewide turnout rate. For the new registrants, it's lower. So these are new registrants who registered with some method other than AVR. But then it's particularly low for new registrants who registered through AVR, through California's version of AVR. So there's a particular need to focus on these. We have a lot of new registrants who are coming onto the file this way, and so they're going to need special outreach, right? And if you break it out by age, by race, ethnicity, the same basic pattern emerges across all groups. All right, pre-registration. This is where you can register when you're 16 or 17, and then that record turns on when you turn 18. This reform was actually passed quite a long time ago, but it was subject, as many of these things were, AVR was kind of the same way, subject to adopting a statewide voter file before it could actually be implemented. And then when it first went online, it was before AVR. So this pre-registration has this interesting joint history with AVR, right? So it came online, and at first you had to do it through paper, right? And then in March of 2017, it was added to online voter registration. But when you went to the online voter registration site, you still needed a driver's license and a state ID, and so it created this extra complication, this extra step that didn't necessarily make it a super easy way for young people to get registered. And so it wasn't until automatic voter registration went online that you had this nice synergy with the driver's license, where when you're getting your driver's license as a 16 or 17-year-old, you can also pre-register to vote. And your signature is captured. At that point, all that stuff is taken care of in one place, right? And so if you look just at the official numbers that come, this bottom line is not zero, it's 50,000. So there were a lot of people who were going through this pre-registration system before AVR, but then this is where AVR, the California New Motor Voter, went live, and you can see that the numbers for pre-registration jacked up quite a bit at that point, and then they have kind of leveled off. They peaked up here. There were some issues with the DMV during the pandemic, and that's probably what this drop is here, and then it's been kind of level since. But in terms of the impact on equity and a representative electorate, it's not super clear that pre-registration specifically has boosted the registration of young people. In fact, starting with This is sort of broken out by age. The bottom line here is 18 to 25. And you can see that over time, it's really retirement age people who have seen their registration accelerate. This actually is consistent with something that Mindy and I have found in looking at just breaking out the demographics of the people who are using AVR. They tend to be older, which is a kind of an interesting pattern. And my best guess is when you turn, I think, 70 in California, you have to go to the DMV to update your driver's license. So there's a kind of a constant process of a touch point there that may encourage people to get registered. Finally, justice-involved populations. There's actually been a pretty significant increase in eligibility for voting for communities touched by incarceration. And I say it that way because there's been two pieces to this. One is changes in how and whether people get incarcerated in the first place. And people don't think of these necessarily as voting reforms, but they can have an impact on the population that is eligible to be registered to vote at the bare minimum. And those big pieces are realignment, which came in 2011, which transferred a large population from state or federal prison to county jail. It didn't actually produce, so there was that transfer, but it didn't actually increase the county jail population by as much as the state and federal population declined. So there was sort of an overall decline in the incarcerated population as coincident with realignment. Then Prop 47, which is a topic of conversation right now because there's the ballot measure this fall that would change some of the characteristics of Prop 47 and increase penalties. But it moved a lot of felonies to be misdemeanors, less lowering the incarceration rate, but also you can still vote, right? You can still get registered. You're not a felon, so you don't lose that opportunity to vote. And then COVID, there was a big drop in the number arrested, and others were released to reduce the transmission risk. And so overall, the incarceration rate between 2011 and 2023 dropped 36%. So quite a significant decline. Here's just a map. This came from a recent PPIC report. We have a great criminal justice team at PPIC, and this came from a report of theirs that was just released that analyzed Prop 47. But you can see each of these moments, right, when the incarcerated population declined a lot. This is the county jail population here, right? So there's that one piece, and then the other is changes in who's legally entitled to vote. Not whether they're incarcerated or not, but given that they have been incarcerated, are they still able to vote? So after realignment, there were a series of legal decisions plus a bill that was carried actually by our current Secretary of State that gave voting rights to basically all felons who are in state or in county jails, which is about, and these are sort of relatively minor felonies that are involved in people who are in county jail. And then Prop 17, which allowed parolees to have the right to vote. So there's not as much data on this question of sort of what has been the impact of these changes on participation and on equity, but you can imagine some challenges here, right? That the incarceration decline has been concentrated among communities that face other barriers. Income barriers, education barriers, a history of exclusion from the voting process. You can see that Black Californians in particular are dramatically overrepresented among the prison population. And then this is just looking at it in a slightly different way. This is sort of what share of and again, I'm leaning on Mindy for both of these charts. She has a very nice report that talks about some of these changes. But you can see that the share of the incarcerated population is disproportionately Black and Latino compared to non-Hispanic white. In addition to the communities, there's also the questions of information and access, right, for these new rights. Like, do you get the information you need, particularly when you're in county jail, to be able to vote? And Mindy did some focus groups with formerly incarcerated people, and found that it was often difficult, as you might imagine, right, to get access to the resources and even just to get your ballot, because the mail goes through a whole process in a jail that it doesn't go through it normally, right? Just kind of wrapping things up. What might we take from all of these different reforms and the impacts that they seem to have had? Well, first of all, we've found that there is this a widening of participation gaps under the in-person consolidation of the Voters' Choice Act. So given it's such a common way of administering elections in California now, identifying what are those pain points for in-person voting and why is it that consolidation is having that effect. I'm kind of working on looking at that myself right now. Looking for ways to promote more new registrations, right? So we have in California, the AVR has promoted both more address updates and more new registrations, but can we get even more new registrations, maybe by expanding the new motor voter, the AVR, to more agencies where the unregistered populations may be higher. We also, I already mentioned, having targeted outreach to California new motor voter registrants. That seems like it would make a lot of sense. And then really leaning into this synergy between pre-registration and AVR by having civics education kind of connect with with all of these new young people who are being registered, pre-registered when they go to the DMV, right? So connect those things. If you're going to have a civics education program, connect it to the fact that you have all these new people who are registered. Make sure that they know. Many of them are now pre-registered, and they may not even be clear on the fact that they are. And then just more and consistent and better information for justice-involved populations. For people who are in county jail, finding a way to get the information that they need to be able to exercise their right to vote. How do we ensure that people are actually eligible to vote when getting their ID registration at the DMV? Can some immigrants be accidentally registered through this process? Yeah, that's actually so that's been one of the key questions around whether we should expand to a different style of AVR in California. There was a bill in the legislature that initially proposed switching to a different kind of approach. Right now, the way that that's handled is there are explicit questions when you go to the DMV that ask about your eligibility, and you have to attest to your eligibility in order to continue in the process. So that's the answer right now. For the people who get if you're undocumented and you get a driver's license, there's some pretty strict firewalls that separate that process from the process where you get the questions about voter registration. So the question is, we've got a slide. I'll go back. Here's the slide for the positive effect for all vote by mail. And the answer is that these are causal estimates that are sort of saying, okay, let's compare people who had all vote by mail to people who didn't have all vote by mail, right? And so in this particular case, these are coming from looking at the whole country, comparing states that switched to all vote by mail to states that didn't, and then having a special sort of call out for California from that broader analysis. And then this other is leveraging the fact that some counties switched to certain types and others didn't. And so probably the easiest way to answer your question is, it's not necessarily the case, so the gaps increased, but it could be that overall, because they were also voting all vote by mail, that they either didn't, in say a VCA county, they either didn't see much change, or it was even maybe positive because they had the all vote by mail piece kind of being added in. You can think of these effects being kind of added to the other ones, right? And so it could be on net that it wasn't that bad, but it's more that, well, okay, but we do have this piece of it where it could have been better, kind of thing, if that makes sense. With all the poll site consolidations, are you saying in-person voting went down or voting in total went down for the various communities you mentioned? I think that was Raul's question, and the answer is no, not necessarily. These are trying to understand what is the independent impact of these changes on participation, and not telling you what the sort of total change was. Have there been efforts to study concentration of polling sites in areas, either in areas maybe where there are higher numbers of African American voters. I don't know of any, but your voter sighting tool may have that information, right?
It has data that can be used for that analysis, yes.
Yes, yeah. I don't know of, to answer the question, I don't know of that research particularly, but it would be easy enough to do. That is a good question. I don't actually know if that information is readily available to know who, on the voter file, you're not going to know who recently became a citizen. But it's an interesting question, right? And how challenging. I mean, at some point, they become a citizen. They, every so often you have to update your driver's license. So it's a 5-year period, I believe. So within 5 years, you'll get the opportunity to update things if you want to. But as far as identifying those folks, one of the challenges with studying AVR in California in general, and actually more broadly, is that information about the people going to the DMV is not readily available. The DMV is very close-lipped. They take the confidentiality of their customers very, very seriously. And so it's really even hard to know. What would be great to know is how many people are going to the DMV and deciding not to get registered, and how far are they making it through the process at the DMV, and so where are they dropping off and deciding not to get registered. And ultimately, it would be great to be able to interview those people and find out something about why they decided not to get registered. I believe that Mindy is working on something along those lines right now, but it's a hard thing to study because you can't get easy data from the DMV about the people who are going through a driver's license transaction. So, thank you so much.